Hi, I'm Eric Bricker. I'm director and producer of Visual Acoustics, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. We love visiting great architecture, and modernist architecture does get visited a lot, but nothing compares to the number of people who enjoy it through photography. Especially this last year, we've all been hunkered down awaiting vaccinations. We're reading and streaming visions of amazing homes, offices, and urban planning. Joining us today is Wayne Thom, a photographer famous for capturing late modern architecture in the western U.S., and our returning podcast guest, Emily Bills, an educator and a writer who just published a book on Wayne's work. And now, with no photographic skills whatsoever, here's your host, George Smart.
Thank you, Tom. I really don't know how this happened, but I have 6 cameras. Recently cleaning out a few closets and boxes, as we all have been doing during the pandemic, I came across the history of my attempts at photography. Some of these are throwaway cameras received at weddings, back when that was a thing. You remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Then there's this 2-megapixel Sony. It's about the size of a bottle of aspirin that I loved in the early 2000s.
And 2 megapixel, that was a lot
That was a
then.
big-time camera. There's a receipt for my first single-lens reflex that was stolen from my Datsun B210 in the early 2000s. My iPhone and my iPad takes better shots than any of these, of course, and it's astonishing how good the equipment has become. But, as I have proven, any idiot can take a photo. But it takes a great eye to capture the essence of a building. Support for U.S. Modernist Radio comes from Wendy Robineau and Don Beskin, and by the U.S. Modernist Library, 3.1 million pages of searchable American architecture magazines going back to 1891. Warning! Enter at your own risk. It's highly addictive. usmodernist.org/library.
Wayne Thom was born in Shanghai in 1933. He grew up in Hong Kong and Vancouver, moving to sunny California to escape Vancouver's cold, dark winters. He took up photography early and at age 15 converted a bathroom in his parents' house into a darkroom. Trained in the technical aspects of photography at Brooks Institute in Santa Barbara, his career spanned almost 50 years, generating vast archives of more than 20,000 images of over 2,600 projects. Wayne's clients included many architects we've mentioned on the show and that we feature at usmodernist.org. William Pereira, Edward Durrell Stone, SOM, John Portman, I.M. Pei, Quincy Jones, the architect, not the musician, and Killingsworth Brady. Welcome, Wayne.
Hello. I'm here.
Okay, good. We're glad you're here. Returning guest Emily Bills is an educator, curator, and author with research interests in urban history and social justice. She received her Ph.D. in architecture and urbanism from New York University, and her work on telephone infrastructure and the development of L.A. received a Graham Foundation Award citation. She is a professor and coordinator of the Urban Studies program at Woodbury University and has developed and taught courses in the New Schools Distance Learning program since moving to L.A. in 2006. With past guests Sam Lubell and Pierluigi Seriano, Emily co-authored the book California Captured, Marvin Rand Mid-Century Modern Architecture, and her new book, Wayne Thom, Photographing the Late Modern, was published in 2020. Welcome, Emily.
Hi. Great to be here.
So, Wayne, how did you get started in all this? I hear a story that involved Quincy Jones in some way. Was that your big break?
Yes. Quincy Jones started my whole career, just like Richard Neutra made Julie Sherman, and I can say Quincy Jones made Wayne Thom. He probably gave me the first major break of my career. I was in his office for interview, And after about an hour talking and discussing architecture and what I want to do and so on and so forth, he gave me 5 projects right there before I even leave his office. There was an infrared industry in Santa Barbara, and the biology building in UC Santa Barbara, and United Church in Northridge, and St. Matthew Church in Pacific Palisades, I think, and also the library in Palo Verde's Peninsula. So with those 5 projects in my hand, took me about a month, and I was very carefully make sure that I do everything right. I went back to the office and presented my result of the 5 projects. And he looked at it and he said, God, Wayne, that's very good, very good. And then he opened his drawer and he pulled a pile of photographs. And he said, now this is what Julie Schumann have done, this is what Marvin Wren have done. Apparently, the project he gave me the photograph is already have been photographed by these well-known architectural photographers in Los Angeles. And he said, you look through what they have done, and I'll come back and talk to you.
Huh. So he was testing you.
And he come back about 15, 20 minutes, and I've gone through the picture from all the photographers, and he said, well, what do you think, Wayne? I say, well, Mr. Jones, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to do this project. And I did take a look at what other photographers have done on the same project. And I think I covered the project as well as they have, and maybe a little bit more. He kind of laughed, and he said, you're right. You're a good photographer, and you're well-trained, but let me give you advice. He said, don't try to do project for everybody, because if you do not be selective on who you work for and the kind of project that you want to photograph, very shortly you're going to lose interest. So be very careful who you're going to work for, what project you're going to accept. And I practiced that ever since. And then he said, well, I'm going to make some phone calls for you. And right there on the spot, he called Phone Led and Kelsey, Jin Wong at Bill Perra's office, and Dick Nipblack at Luckman's office, and Carl Clarkey at A.C. Martin, who did most of the big project in Los Angeles. And basically, he introduced me to this director of design and say, we want to keep Wayne Thom in Los Angeles here, so you're going to call you for interview, spend some time with him. So that's how my big break.
That's a big break.
That's really
that's
huge. That's
how I got started.
You were right in there with all the big architects of commercial buildings in Los Angeles.
That's right. And and ever since then, I just ride on that wave and then build out my portfolio. And then I spent out from Los Angeles to San Francisco, and then to San Diego, and then to Portland and Seattle and Phoenix, Arizona, and just go wherever the project take me. And whenever I have a project in a new city, I want to make sure that I spend some time to explore who is a good designer in the area. And then I also interview. That's how I do my marketing. It's all personal. I don't have an agent. I never advertise. And so just the only exposure I get is because of doing some of these higher profile projects I get published in magazines like Architectural Record and Progressive Architecture in those days. And that's how I got started.
Emily, I know we loved talking with you about Marvin Wren when you were on the show before. How did you discover Wayne?
I was lucky enough to meet Wayne when he was looking to place his archive somewhere. He wanted to shepherd it into an institution that would take good care of it. And he came to Woodbury University with Nicholas Oldsberg, looking to do an exhibition of his work. So I met him then and was an immediate fan of his photography. And a number of years later, I had an opportunity when I was teaching at the University of Southern California, which eventually acquired his archive, to teach a class to a group of heritage conservation students in the School of Architecture. And I used that as an opportunity to jump into the archive. I thought it was a great chance for students who are engaged with heritage conservation and historic preservation to work in an archive of a great local photographer and to look at a number of buildings that are of interest now, not only historically, but also in terms of saving them from wrecking balls. And so we organized our class around the Wayne Thom archive at USC. And the students created an online exhibition and had the wonderful opportunity to work with Wayne, who lives not too far from USC. And I spent so much time in the archive and working with the students and talking with Wayne that I just didn't want it to end. And it occurred to me that there's a book project here that more people need to know about his work, and what a great opportunity to do so. So I asked Wayne if he was willing, and he was, and it led to this great opportunity to write this book.
Was this the first book about Wayne's work?
Yes. This is the first book.
Well, it's a really wonderful book. I have it here in front of me. I've been looking through it. Emily, tell me about this term late modern. I think it really wasn't until I saw your book that I saw that phrase. When is the late modern?
Roughly defined, the late modern is likely, late 1960s through the early 1980s. Some people consider it a transition time between mid-century modernism and postmodernism. And it's a really exciting time. It's a period in which architects who were mostly trained during the mid-century period sort of find their own way, and they redefine the principles that they were taught in. It's a very experimental period in a lot of ways.
This is where you had buildings that looked like all sorts of things.
Absolutely. I would say there's a couple of different areas that Wayne and I focused on in the book, different experiments in materials and forms, one of which is the really dynamic use of poured concrete construction, which you see in buildings like the Geisel Library, designed by Pereira's office. And then, the Transamerica Tower in San Francisco is perhaps the most iconic of those concrete buildings at the time. There's also a lot of experimentation in glass, so a movement from transparency and lightness that you see in the mid-century period to mirror glass architecture, this highly reflective, smooth surface, an all-over gridded surface that comes to define office park architecture around the world, and that we can really trace back to experiments done by Cesar Pelli and Anthony Lumpton, a lot of that in Los Angeles while they're working at Dim Jim. And then I would say another form of architecture that sort of finds its own wings and becomes experimental at this time is wood frame construction. And there are a lot of delightful houses and real sort of whimsy that you see being experimented with at this time that, comes to define California hippie culture and laid-back attitude of California.
Wayne, when we talked with Eric Bricker, who did a film on Julius Shulman, he told me that Julius never really embraced digital photography at all, but you did, right?
Well, not really. To me, the digital photography is a big progress of doing photography, but actually it's not photography. Digital, I call it the digital imaging. Photography is taking a camera loaded with film, and then you expose a sheet of film, and then you process the film in the developer, and that become a negative. And then you put the negative in an enlarger, and then project an image on a piece of paper. And then you put this piece of paper in a tray of chemical. And then all of a sudden, like magic, an image appears in that piece of paper. And that is photography.
That's old school photography.
That is photography. Digital is not photography. Digital is what I call arranging pixel.
Okay.
And then it goes through, and then you go through Photoshop or Lightroom, and you're just rearranging whatever mistake you make or whatever you don't like to see. So you manipulate the pixel to make it look good. That's not photography. That's called imaging. The big difference to me between photography and digital imaging is photography, you have to perceive what picture you're trying to create, how it's going to look. Then you program the process with your technical know-how to achieve that image at the final result. I practice this all 50 years. I expose one sheet of film. That's it. And a lot of people, they bracket one overexposed, one underexposed, and then hope one will come out. I say, no, that's not professional approach of doing a job. I'm a professional photographer. I should know what I'm doing. If I don't do it right, it's my fault, and you can do it again. So digital imaging, you take the camera, don't cost anything. You just keep clicking away. That's why they call them shooter. I do not shoot. I take photographs.
And you do not bracket.
I do not go to a shoot. I go to assignment. And I'm making photograph as a photographer. I'm not taking snapshot as a shooter. Okay?
Okay. We got it. We got it, Wayne.
This is why I hate it. I really hate it when nowadays people say, I'm a shooter. I'm going to a shot. I'm taking a shot. I mean, that's so unprofessional. If you're a photographer, you take picture. You don't take a snapshot. Now I got that out of my chest.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Emily will know exactly how I feel about this subject. Matter of fact, that was an interview by a platform called Think Muse, M-U-S-E. And I have expressed on that interview very exactly what I thought about digital photography and photography by film and darkroom technique.
Okay. Wayne, I have another question for you. Something in the book caught my eye, so I wanted to ask. Your mother began working kind of as a spy for the U.S. When did you discover that?
After my mother passed away, we were clearing out some of her personal stuff, and we come across this one letter from General Canuck, commendating thanking her for her service for the USIS. We know she was working for USIS, but we really didn't know what she was doing, because when we were in Kunming during the war, because of the air raid and all the constant bombing by the Japanese, me and my two brothers and my grandmother was living outside the city to avoid the bombardment and the air raid. And my mother and father would come and visit us on the weekend. So I really do not know exactly what she was doing with USIS until we found this letter from General Canuck thanking her for her service. So we still do not know exactly what she do, but I know she do a lot of underground work. So that was the story about USIS. That's before it became CIA.
Right, that was the predecessor to the CIA.
And after the war, we moved back to Hong Kong.
Now, Emily, in the process of putting together this book on Wayne, how would you compare Wayne's work with other photographers in terms of his style and how he approaches it? I mean, we know that he's not going to be a pixel arranger. So what else can you tell us about Wayne?
I think Wayne's approach to photography perfectly matched the era of late modernism, in that he adapts his camera to the particular architectural assignment. And you have to understand it, for late modernism, as I mentioned before, architecture can't really be pinned down to one style or, sort of set framework that you can articulate easily. People are experimenting with different materials in different ways, so it's really quite diverse. And Wayne is such a skilled technician. He made a point of going to a school that could teach him how to take photographs, less theory-oriented and more skill-building. And he became a consummate professional. And so when he approaches a building, it's not so much about his own style, but what is the best way or the best technique, the best weather, the best environment that he needs to utilize in order to capture the building, to put the architect's creation the best foot forward. And so he would go into a architecture firm and he would talk to the design architects about their approach to a particular building, and they would talk about the model, and he would photograph the model, and then he would go to the site and consider what materials were being used and how they interacted with the environment and the weather at any particular time. And then he would take some time to compose the photograph. And then just as he said, instead of taking a lot of photographs and deciding which one in the end was the best, he put in this homework so that when it came time to finally release the shutter, he knew exactly what he was doing and in what particular way, so that when that photograph came out, it was just as he had pictured it in his head. And it takes a lot of skill and practice to be able to do that. And so he was not only able to do that, with one type of building, he was able to do that with mirror glass or with a dynamic poured concrete construction or with a subtle wood shingled building out on a beach. So he was really flexible in that way.
Wayne, as you worked with different architects, what were some of the magazines they wanted to get into?
In my day, in the 70s and 80s and 90s, there were architectural record and progressive architecture before they went kaput, and then architecture, which is a journal for the AIA, and the Japan architects. That was a good, and Dumas magazine, and also Apathy that we quite often get project published. I know most of these magazine editor and publisher, but I do not want to act as a PR person for the architect's office. However, the magazine come to me and say, Wayne, we were going to do an article on shopping mall or school. Have you have any project that you think we should consider? And I will recommend a certain project, to the magazine and tell them who to talk to in that office. And that's it. I step out from there because I don't want to get involved with doing the PR visits. And so I'm a conduit between the magazine and the architect's office. And that's the only marketing that I will ever, as far as going marketing my service, that's about as far as I will go.
So did the magazines typically come to you, or did they come more often to the architect and ask them for photos?
Well, like in Architectural Record, I work with Betty Thompson, who is based in San Francisco, who is the Western editor. And we talk frequently, at least once a month. And then John Paxson at the Progressive Architecture. And so, I become personal friends. See, all my whole practice, the secret is I do not approach my clients as a client or the source of income. They become my personal friend. In my whole life, I never work one day. I just live a beautiful way of life because my relationship with the people that I work with, they all become my friends. Like when I go to Denver, Colorado, I don't stay in a hotel. I stay with Carl Worthington, who is a good architect in Boulder, Colorado, and I stay with him. And, when I go to Aspen, Harry Teague and David Warner, they are good friends. So, to me, it's not so much of a client-photographer relationship. It's a photographer and friendship. And we talk architecture, and we talk about that project, And I got to understand where they come from, the design process and the challenge and the solution for the problem. I have to understand and trying to get myself familiar with before I even go to the project. And I also insist that the architect or the designer walk with me on that project before I photograph. And I even prefer they come with me when I execute my photography, because then now they know how I work. Now they will appreciate my final result because they know I'm not just going out taking snapshots. And so that's how I work. It's a way of life. It's a way of life. I never work one day in my life.
That's really beautiful. You're simply taking photographs for friends.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. In 50 years of practice, nobody have ever sued me. And I have one client that I have to take him to court to collect my fee. And that's one out of, how many thousands.
Yes, that's pretty good.
Yeah. I would say you're lucky, but there's more to it than just luck.
He's good. He's lucky and good.
Yep.
When I make my presentation to the client, I always say, okay, if I miss anything, let me know. I'll go back and pick it up. There's no question asked. This is a reason why my fee schedule is not based on my time I spend. It's based on the scope of the project. And I will cover the project totally until my client is happy. Sometimes I go back to the same project 6 months later because of condition, the sky condition, especially doing a reflective mirror glass building. When the sky change, the whole building change. So I don't just say, I'll spend one day doing this project. I spend time to satisfy myself and my client. That's how I work.
You're a true artist, Wayne.
I just want to be happy, and I just want to be my client to be happy, and my friends to be happy. That's all.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting when you look at how a photographer markets themselves at that time. Julius Shulman and Marvin Rand built a career in large part because they had these close relationships with magazine editors. And so a client knew that if they hired Julius would work to get a photograph into that magazine. And I think it's a real testament to Wayne and his interest in the buildings. And, he explained that to you. And I talked about it a little bit, but I think it's really important, the amount of time that he spent, studying a building in the office with the design architect, understanding how the facade was put together. The facade is always very important to the architect. And then taking time at the site to really understand how to best represent that building based on the design of the building, not just how it will look in an image, but how can he best communicate the intention behind the design. And then he wasn't marketing those photographs necessarily, but the editors knew to come to Wayne to ask him what was the most exciting late modern architecture. The term wasn't, used in exactly that way back then, but, what is the latest thing going on? And they trusted his eye and his expertise. And, his photographs would then appear in publications that let the rest of the world know what was happening in the West Coast. And, the West Coast was always a place of innovation, and it continued to be after the mid-century period. And I would say, two publications came out that were quite important. One was Arthur Drexler's exhibition catalog for transformations in modern architecture. It was a huge sweeping exhibition. I think it left a lot of people bewildered because there were just so many photographs and buildings in it. But there were only, I believe, a couple color photographs in that exhibition catalog, and one was of Wayne's CNA building. And so this completely changes the perspective on what's happening in architecture in California, and Wayne's photograph represents that. It's this wonderful mirror glass tower in the middle of a park. Wayne has a fabulous story to tell how exactly he captured the clouds on the facade of the building at a particular moment in time after a storm. So that building came to represent with the Museum of Modern Art, and Arthur Drexler thought was late modern architecture. And then the other one was, of course, the 1978 cover that Wayne landed with his photograph of the Bonaventure Hotel, which, of course, was another one of those Los Angeles buildings that, completely changed the way people started thinking about architecture at that time, with these wonderful 3 cylinders wrapped in mirror glass architecture, sort of the new star on the horizon in the Bunker Hill area in downtown Los Angeles. So I think that's sort of important to note, how people see architecture and understand architecture is often happening through photographs, and having photographs in publications is the way people see them. So Wayne was a real influence on how people were understanding and learning about the changing landscape of the built environment.
The book is Wayne Thom, Photographing the Late Modern. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you for having me and putting up with my rambling on and on.
No, you're great.
You're quite a storyteller.
I will really appreciate that.
Thank you, George. We appreciate it.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Wendy Robineau and Don Beskin, and by the U.S. Modernist Library. You've been warned, completely warned. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 8,000 significant modernist houses, and access 3.1 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Rogue archivist Carrie Cesarino researches guests while running the accounting for 2 organizations, coordinating modernist volunteers across the nation, and yearning for a future when a night out might actually mean being inside a building with lots of people.
And alcohol.
U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I'll be back soon with another late modernist, wildly photogenic edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.